On Saturday the 26th of February 1949, 3 men arrived at a small backstreet storehouse in the Sussex village of Crawley. The storehouse, a brick-built shed on 2 floors, was surrounded by a 6-foot wooden fence and secured by a mortise and padlock. One of the men, a Mr. Edward Jones, was managing director of a small engineering firm called Hursley Products, which owned the storehouse in Giles Yard, Leopold Road. The other 2 were Detective Sergeant Pat Heslin of the West Sussex Constabulary and Police Sergeant Appleton, the village policeman. Jones had already spoken to Heslin about the storehouse. His firm used it to store steel and other surplus materials, and it was occasionally used by a business associate of his from London. The associate was allowed to do with it as he pleased, though he told Heslin that it was for work and experiments. This man was not an employee of the firm, but came to Jones with various manufacturing jobs and orders, and from time to time suggested new engineering ideas. Mr. Jones' own impressions, he told the detective, was that some kind of conversion work was being done in the storehouse, but he could not say precisely what. His associate had borrowed the keys a few days before and had not yet returned them. So Heslin picked up a steel bar and prized the padlock open. At first glance, the whitewashed interior seemed quite ordinary. Paint pots, bits of wood and metal, old bottles and rags lay scattered on 2 rough benches along with various tools and implements. Methodically, Heslin noted down all other items inside the storehouse. All of them seemed in keeping with its purpose, although a peculiar mix. A rubber apron, heavily stained with chemicals, a large pair of rubber boots, a stirrup pump, a gas mask, some rubber gloves, a riding mackintosh, and large carboys packed in straw and resting in metal frames. These were standard industrial containers for keeping dangerous acids in. In and around the yard they found several 45-gallon oil drums, all of them in varying stages of corrosion. But looking closer on a bench, Heslin began to understand why the police in London were so interested in Jones' colleague. There he found a small leather hat box and a good quality leather briefcase. A dirty storeroom was a very curious place to leave important personal possessions. The case contained various papers and documents, including 3 ration books and various clothing coupons. The contents of the hat box were even more intriguing. It contained passports, driving licenses, diaries, a checkbook, and a marriage certificate. Upon closer inspection, Heslin realized that none of these bore the name of Jones' colleagues. But most surprisingly of all, at the bottom of the box, the detective found a .38 revolver and a supply of bullets. Heslin was a sound, practical officer who did not look for exotic explanations when faced with the obvious. The gun pointed to murder. Nothing had been concealed, and clearly whoever left it there had been very confident of avoiding suspicion. Heslin filed his report. The officers waiting for the report were based in fashionable, well-heeled district of London's Chelsea. They were investigating an unusual disappearance. Even in those days, the police were accustomed to missing children and teenagers and sometimes young women, but it was very rare for a dignified widow of 69 to disappear. Mrs. Henrietta Helen Olivia Roberts Durand Deacon had been missing since the 18th of February. A wealthy woman, she had lived for years in the cosy atmosphere of the Onslow Court Hotel in Queensgate, one of Kensington's main thoroughfares. Her close friend, Mrs. Constance Lane, had noticed that Mrs. Durand Deacon was not at her dinner table that evening. The next day, the 19th of February, after Mrs. Durand Deacon had failed to appear for breakfast, Mrs. Lane was approached by a man who also lived in the hotel. A neat, short man with a trim moustache, who was around 40 years old. He was called Mr. John Haigh. Mrs. Lane had never liked him. There was something false about his glib smile and easy charm. Haigh inquired after Mrs. Durand Deacon, saying she had failed to appear for an appointment with him the previous day. By now, highly anxious, Mrs. Lane spoke to the chambermaid, who said Mrs. Durand Deacon's bed had not been slept in. But Mrs. Lane still waited. In 1949, respectable people, even close friends, did not lightly interfere in each other's lives. On the 20th of February, Haigh again stopped at Mrs. Lane's breakfast table with the same oily concern. She told him bluntly she was going to the police. Observantly, she noticed how Haigh seemed to ponder this. After breakfast, Haigh went up to Mrs. Lane in the hotel lobby and suggested they go to the police station together. In his smart grey overcoat and leather driving gloves, Haigh looked impressive at the wheel of his Alvis, a seemingly stylish, successful man with a cigarette placed racily between his lips. Hay's self-confident veneer helped him through the first shock. Mrs. Lane had already known about Mrs. Durand Deacon's appointment with Haigh before he told her. Mrs. Durand Deacon had told Mrs. Lane about it herself before setting off. Haigh smoothly explained to the police that dear Mrs. Durand Deacon had worryingly never turned up. With the interview over, Haigh promised that he would help all he could. It was a strange comment. Friends of missing people are assumed to be willing to help all they can. Haigh had interested the police. His charm was superficial, but they could see that. But there was something more substantial. Mrs. Durand Deacon had told Mrs. Lane precisely why she had an appointment with Mr. Haigh. It was to discuss a business idea she had thought up. She wanted to manufacture imitation fingernails. The idea was wholly Mrs. Durand Deacon's. What intrigued the police at Chelsea was why Haigh, a supposedly capable small businessman, should have endorsed such a bizarre idea. This was, after all, 1949, and rationing was still in force. Spending money was scarce, and credit was not easy to come by. Who on earth did Haigh imagine he could sell false fingernails to? Hay's showy self-confidence left its mark on the detectives handling the case. They called on him the next day at the Onslow Court Hotel. Haigh told them again he would be happy to tell you all he knew about it, and made a rambling statement. Its essence was that he had no idea where Mrs. Durand Deacon was. 3 days later, on Thursday the 24th of February, Haigh was interviewed again at the hotel. He covered the same ground, and repeated that he was willing to help in any way he could. But this time, female police sergeant Alexandra Lambourne was present. Apart from the fact I do not like the man, Haigh, with his mannerisms, she wrote in her report, I have a sense that he is wrong, and there may be a case behind the whole business. Sergeant Lambourne's intuition suddenly gave shape to her colleague's uneasiness. Haigh was checked out. He had been jailed 3 times, twice for obtaining money by fraud, and once for theft. Further inquiries in London and Sussex showed that he owed money and that he was struggling to pay his hotel bills. When news arrived of the .38 revolver and the obviously stolen documents being found in Hay's storehouse, the detectives felt they were closing in on a callous, smart aleck who had gone too far. On the 28th of February, the day after the visit to the storehouse, Mrs. Durand Deacon's jewellery was located at a dealer's in Horsham, Sussex, and Hay's description fitted that of the seller. When a dry cleaning ticket found in the hat box led to the discovery of a Persian lamb coat, the case seemed to be over. At 4:15 p.m. on the same day, Detective Inspector Albert Webb was waiting at the Onslow Court Hotel when Hay's Alvis pulled up. When the inspector asked him to come to the station for questioning, Haigh appeared completely unruffled. "Certainly," he replied affably. "I'll do anything to help, as you know." Haigh took on a nonchalant air at the police station. He had arrived so promptly that no one was ready to interview him. He was placed in a divisional detective inspector's office, where he sat, smoked and dozed off. At 6 p.m. he was given a cup of tea. At 7:30 p.m, Divisional Detective Inspector Shelley Sims entered the office with the Superintendent Barrett and Inspector Webb. Sims, an astute and experienced detective, began with some minor points. Haigh lied blandly about them, so Sims revealed that the revolver, the coat and the jewellery had all been recovered. "Ah," Haigh said, barely ruffled. He puffed on his cigarette. "I can see you know what you're talking about. I admit the coat belonged to Mrs. Durand Deacon and that I sold her jewellery." "How did you come by the property?" Sims pressed. "And where is Mrs. Durand Deacon?" The 3 detectives sat watching as Haigh smoked and thought. His collar and cuffs were immaculate, his tie in place, the shine on his shoes unsoiled. Hay's composure was incredible. Even within moments of being found out, his mind was at work trying to figure out some means of escape. Finally, when ready, he spoke. "It's a long story," he drawled. "It's one of blackmail, and I shall have to implicate many others." Just then the phone rang. Sims and Barrett were summoned from the room. Not knowing how much the police had on him, or what they might come up with now, Haigh suddenly made up his mind. There was some chance for survival. Left alone with the least senior officer, Haigh relaxed further. He spoke to Webb as a friend. "Tell me frankly, what are the chances of anyone being released from Broadmoor?" he asked. John George Haigh was born in Stamford, Lincolnshire on the 24th of July 1909. His parents were strict members of the fundamentalist Christian sect known as the Plymouth Brethren. and their religious views dominated Hay's childhood. The Plymouth Brethren were a religious sect that was formed around 1830. The movement grew out of the dismay by many Christians at the division in the church at the time. Early members were fervent, austere people who wanted to concentrate on quiet, regular prayer meetings by abstaining from worldly pleasures, such as newspapers, books, and social contacts with non-members. What united the founders was a desire for a unity of purpose, although religious ideas differed little from mainstream Christianity. Generally, the Brethren were anti-clerical and believed that they were the sole representatives of Christianity, a trait that encouraged intolerance. Seeking to build a household that no worldly evil can penetrate, John and Emily Haigh banned newspapers, radio, and even simple entertainments from the house. George, as they called their son, was forbidden to play sports away from school and was always dressed formally. The family held prayer readings from the Bible at home every day, and George was brought up to believe in the complete literal truth of the Bible, wars, slaughters, sacrifices, and all. From my earliest years, my recollection is of my father saying, "Do not," or "Thou shalt not," Haigh would later say. Much of Hay's boyhood was spent in Yorkshire, near Outwood Colliery, where his father was a foreman. As he grew older, George rarely mixed with other children, apart from at school. His parents looked down their noses at neighbours and would have nothing to do with those who were not involved with the Plymouth Brethren. Outwardly, Haigh was a cheerful and well-behaved child. Some parents would feel suspiciously so. But inwardly, he wrestled with some of his father's grander visions. Haigh Sr. had a blue scar on his forehead from having once been hit by a chip of flying coal. It was the mark of Satan, he told young George. "I have sinned and been punished," he said. "If you ever sin, Satan will do the same to you." As a boy, he was also repeatedly told that his mother, to whom he remained deeply attached, was literally an angel with wings. It was a story that was to remain printed indelibly in his mind. At school, Haigh was extremely lazy, almost ignoring those subjects he didn't like, though he did show a flair for sciences. He soon became aware of the fact that he could lie easily, get away with it, and not be punished, either by God or man. It was also at school that he developed his talent for forgery. It started off as a game, but it was a gift that became crucial in his life of crime. A more pleasant side of Hay's character was his musical talent. Throughout his life, his love of music and his ability as a pianist won him many friends. At 17, with no qualifications, Haigh left school. His first employer commented he was lazy, he was always late, but he had a charm, and I liked him. In no time, the choir boy had become a con man, first by stealing cars, and then by obtaining money on hire purchase agreements with fictitious addresses. And this would soon move on to ingenious, well-planned frauds that were often ruined by inattention to detail. A favourite of his was setting up as a solicitor, using the name of the real lawyer taken from the law list. Haigh would then place advertisements saying he was winding up an estate and offering shares at below market value for a deposit of 25%. When checks started arriving, Haigh would then bank them and set up in another district. His undoing would come in 1937. He had letterheads printed from the town of Guildford spelt as Guilford, omitting the D, and would-be investigators became suspicious. Spells in prison would soon follow, but released from jail for a third time in September 1943, Haigh was even more determined to make his mark on the world. He got a job as a salesman for a small fancy goods manufacturer based in Crawley. He soon began to gather a socially acceptable circle of friends, but in spite of the pleasant life in Sussex, Haigh was drawn back to the blight of London. In 1944, he would move back to London and rent a bedsit, and with his savings formed a company called the Union Group Engineering at 79 Queensgate Terrace. It was soon after this that he met William McSwan, for whom he worked in 1936. As it turned out, it was a fateful meeting for both of them. But we'll come back to that. For now, let's return to Detective Inspector Albert Webb and John Haigh in the interview room. Detective Inspector Webb pondered the question that Haigh had asked him, and then warned him that he was not obliged to say anything. Haigh impatiently waved the warning aside and carried on regardless. "If I told you the truth," he said, "you would not believe it. It's too fantastical. But I will tell you about it," he said. "Mrs. Durand Deacon no longer exists. She has disappeared completely, and no trace of her can ever be found. I have destroyed her with acid. You will find sludge that remains at Leopold Road. Every other trace has gone." "How can you prove the murder if there's no body?" Haigh asked. Suddenly, Webb remembered the Sussex police report, the stirrup pump, the gas mask, the metal drums, and the acid and sludge. Was this a fictitious yarn? What was Haigh talking about? Webb tried to imagine what else the acid might have been for in the storehouse, then hurried off to tell his senior officers. Superintendent Barrett exploded. "He's been having you on," he told Webb. "Fairy tales, absolute nonsense." All three detectives recoiled from the idea. If Mrs. Durand Deacon was dead, as seemed all but certain, then they wanted a simple open and shut case of murder for greed. None of them had ever heard of anything as grotesque as dissolving people in acid. Moreover, Haigh had disclosed his line of defence, insanity. So self-assured had he been that he was more worried about getting out of Broadmoor than finding his way into it. In 1949, few detectives believed that a killer might be insane unless he was a visibly ranting, incoherent lunatic and beyond any form of self-control. Haigh was hardly this type. To the Chelsea detectives, he was a glib villain who they held in contempt. They probably feared that Haigh might manipulate the law, the psychiatrists and the courts, and finally cheat the hangman. After Haigh had been formally cautioned, Inspector Sims impassively began writing down Hay's statement. Apart from a brief interval for tea and cheese sandwiches, it took 2.5 hours, with Haigh still happily smoking as he described how Mrs. Durand Deacon had died. "Having taken her into the storeroom at Leopold Road, I shot her in the back of the head while she was examining some papers for use as fingernails," he said. "I then went out to the car and fetched in a drinking glass and made an incision, I think with a penknife, if I remember correctly, in the side of her throat. I collected a glass of her blood, and then I drank it." Haigh went on to describe how he removed Mrs. Durand Deacon's valuables, her Persian lamb coat, her rings, necklace, earrings and crucifix, and then put her body into the tank of acid. The detectives listened and watched without comment. Mad or sane, a true statement or a pack of lies, they noticed how Haigh expressed himself with utterly unfeeling care. His grammar seemed to matter more to Haigh than his victims. "I had filled up the tank with sulfuric acid by means of a stirrup pump from a carboy, and then I left it to react." This, they believed, was Hay's way of saying he had set out to remove all traces of Mrs. Durand Deacon. But he suddenly seemed to remember something else. "Oh, I should have said that in between putting her in the tank and pumping in the acid, I went around to the Ancient Priors and had a cup of tea." The restaurant Haigh had referred to, fully named Ye Olde Ancient Priors, was nearby in Crawley Square. Inquiries showed that beside the cup of tea, after he'd killed, he ate a poached egg on toast. The evidence was bewildering. Detectives Sims, Barrett and Webb all understood what was being claimed: vampirism. At any rate, they were dealing with a man who could sit quite calmly, happily drinking tea in a public place immediately after shooting an elderly woman. Haigh then described how he had taken the jewellery to the car and then gone for dinner at the George Hotel's restaurant, put the revolver in the hat box and driven back to Onslow Court Hotel, where, the next morning, he paused at Mrs. Lane's breakfast table to express his concern over Mrs. Durand Deacon. The account of events inside the storehouse then resumed. "On Monday, I returned to Crawley to find the reaction almost complete, but a piece of fat and bone was still floating on the sludge. I emptied off the sludge with a bucket," Haigh continued, "and tipped it on the ground opposite the shed. I then pumped a further quantity of acid into the tank to decompose the remaining fat and bone. On Tuesday, I returned to Crawley and found decomposition had completed." Altogether, Haigh received £100 for Mrs. Durand Deacon's jewellery from Bull's Jewellers in Horsham, and £10 for her watch from a shop in Putney. He repaid £36 of a loan of £50 made to him by Mr. Jones of Hursley Products, owner of the storehouse, and reduced his overdraft of £83. By now, Haigh had been speaking for an hour or more in painfully exact detail, concerned at all times to get everything in its right order. He had told stories of vampirism and genteel cups of tea, of greed and bankruptcy, of deceit and bad debts, and of forgery and fraud, but the story was not over. Haigh continued talking, smoking with cat-like pleasure, as his revelations poured out. By the early hours of the 1st of March, he had confessed to 5 more murders. The first, he said, had taken place on the 9th of September 1944. The victim was an old acquaintance, William McSwan. He'd killed him in a basement flat at 79 Gloucester Road near the Onslow Court Hotel. A year later, Haigh lured McSwan's trusting parents, Donald and Amy, to the same basement and coshed both of them over the head. He forged Donald's signature to gain power of attorney over their estate. While selling one of their properties, Haigh met Dr. Archibald Henderson and his wife Rosalie. For their killings, he chose the Giles Yard storeroom. Haigh said that in each case he had destroyed the bodies with acid after drinking a cup of their blood. The arrest of Haigh riveted the public's attention. Stories of acid baths, rumours of ritualistic blood drinking, the remorseless killing of an elderly woman all generated disgust and fascination. Haigh's immaculate appearance, slicked back hair and all-weather smile increased the antagonism felt against him. His remand appearances before Horsham magistrates drew large fiery crowds inside and outside the courtroom. Young housewives jeered and shouted catcalls while elderly men in caps out for a morning stroll peered forward for a glimpse of Haigh. Many others in the crowds looked worried and perplexed as they tried to read what they could on Haigh's unruffled features. To some, such as the women who stampeded towards Haigh on the 1st of April, after he had been committed for trial, Haigh was purely evil. But others had begun to sense the bewildering contradictions in his character. His killings, they thought, might have been the act of a madman. The confidence and tricks were not. On the 4th of March, after being transferred from Chelsea to Lewes Prison in Sussex, Haigh asked to see Detective Inspector Webb, his former interrogator. Haigh told Webb he thought it timely to mention 3 more murders he had committed. 2 of the victims, a woman and a youth, came from West London. The 3rd was a girl from Eastbourne. This brought his total number of victims to 9. By this stage, however, the authorities were concentrating on Mrs. Durand Deacon. Hers was the only murder Haigh was ever charged with. The police wanted a no-nonsense conviction, with public sympathy too outraged by the killings of an elderly lady for reprieve to be granted. In the run-up to Haigh's trial, 2 complex scientific inquiries were launched. One, led by Scotland Yard, investigated the acidic remains at the Crawley storehouse. The other, for the defence, investigated Haigh's mind. The former proved simpler. Dr. Keith Simpson of London University, the pathologist attached to the Home Office, first carried out routine blood tests at the storehouse to ensure the bloodstains in the shed matched to Mrs. Durand Deacon's blood group. He then turned to the weed-covered yard outside. Following zigzag scratches in the ground where Haigh had pushed the acid drum containing the body, Simpson found the spot where Haigh had emptied the sludge. Soon he noticed a stone the size of a cherry and highly polished. It was a gallstone. Simpson handed it to D.S. Heslin, saying, "There you are, Sergeant. That's the first trace of a human body." Haigh had never considered the possibility that some objects take longer to corrode than others. Gallstones, for instance, which are covered in fat, resist acid for some time. Chief Inspector Guy Marn of the murder squad congratulated Simpson. "I was looking for it," Simpson snapped back. "Women of Mrs. Durand Deacon's age and habits, 69 and fairly plump, are prone to gallstones." Mrs. Durand Deacon had in fact weighed 14 stone, but careless Haigh had left enough evidence to settle all questions of identification many times over. These included remains of the left foot, which Simpson painstakingly reassembled with microscope and X-ray equipment. Scotland Yard's laboratory made a cast and found it perfectly fitted one of Mrs. Durand Deacon's shoes. The sludge also included traces of pelvic bones and 2 discs from the lower spinal column, a total of 18 fragments in all. Haigh's greatest error had been to miscalculate the time needed for acid to break down the acrylic resin from which false teeth are made. One set of dentures was found at the storehouse, and the dentist who made it confirmed that Mrs. Durand Deacon had been his patient. Examination of a 24-square-foot area of topsoil, 3 inches deep, also revealed the handle of Mrs. Durand Deacon's handbag, a lipstick container cap, a notebook, and other personal items. Around 475 pounds of sludge and soil was removed, packed into boxes and painstakingly examined at the laboratory by the forensics team. Simpson then moved into the workshop, where he found some of Hay's clothing and bloodstains on the wall. Sections of the plaster were removed and placed in storage. A hairpin was found in the grease at the bottom of one of Hay's oil drums. It was very typical of Haigh to devise a wily, thorough plan only to see it ruined with elementary mistakes. But there is no sign that he was shocked or even dismayed by the collapse of his corpus delicti beliefs. Haigh remained unquestionably optimistic. As one saviour or escape route vanished, so he would dream up a larger-than-life trust in the next. First, no one would find the storehouse. Once found, no trace would be found of Mrs. Durand Deacon. With her identification complete, there was still Broadmoor, not the gallows, to look forward to. After confessing to 9 murders, Haigh was still charming his fellow prisoners inside Lewes Prison. He would generously hand them cigarettes when other inmates would have sold them. His shoes were always polished, and whether alone in his cell or the exercise yard, he carried his lemon kid gloves. One inmate joked that Haigh was the best-dressed prisoner of the year. Several people who met Haigh in prison before his trial became convinced the stories of vampirism were a sham. Haigh was quite sure that he would be sent to Broadmoor and forecast that he would be released after 5 to 10 years. Haigh found one inmate who had actually been inside Broadmoor and plied him with questions about all the various symptoms of insanity. His belief in his own charmed life remained. On being told he would be represented by Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, a Nuremberg prosecutor, Haigh wrote, "I'm very glad to see we have got old Maxie. He's no fool." But the question remained, was John George Haigh insane? Hay's crimes baffle people by combining petty, calculating thefts, brutal violence, and his bizarre methods of destroying the evidence. To this he added his claims of vampirism. In 1949, criminals were punished if they knew the nature and quality of their crimes. But if they suffered from such defect of reason from disease of the mind, they did not grasp fully what they were doing, they could still be convicted of offences but spared the severest punishments. These definitions were set out by the Umnatan Rules in 1843, following an attempt to kill the then Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel by a deranged assassin, Daniel Norton. Haigh never claimed that he was mad simply because he had killed 6 people, possibly 9. The law has never recognised this approach to sanity. Instead, he claimed he was a vampire. It was easy to see the way his mind was working. What normal persons kills up to 9 people in cold blood, drinks their blood, drinks their own urine in prison, as he claimed to have done, remains cool, calm and smiling whilst the police neck closes in on him, and compares himself to a German dictator, Hitler, and a Chinese philosopher, Confucius. Hay's solicitor recognised that much of his behaviour was merely odd or perhaps perverse, but hardly enough to let their client escape the gallows. The psychiatric evidence at his trial concentrated on Hay's claims to have drunk his victim's blood, his fantasies and dreams, and on the scars of his fanatically religious upbringing. The only defence witness was Dr. Henry Yellowlees, who spent only a very short period of time talking to Haigh in a prison cell. Yellowlees appears to have accepted that Haigh had dream visions of forests turning into blood, pouring down a crucifix, and told the court that Haigh was suffering from paranoia. Yellowlees called this condition a disease, but was unable to convince the jury that Haigh had known the meaning and quality of his crimes. On the contrary, it was quite obvious that Haigh knew that killing, theft, forgery, and destroying evidence were all against the law and punishable. The drift of opinion inside and outside the court was that Haigh was inventing stories of vampirism and of drinking his own urine purely to save his own neck. Hay's trial for the murder of Olive Durand Deacon opened at Lewes Assizes on the 18th of July 1949 and lasted for 2 days. The case was heard by the foremost criminal judge of his day, Mr. Justice Humphreys. Haigh pleaded not guilty and set about doing crossword puzzles during the proceedings, a further indication of how unconcerned he was. For all of the first day, the prosecution, led by the Attorney General Sir Hartley Shawcross, produced evidence about the Crawley storehouse, the acid drums, Mrs. Durand Deacon's disappearance, and Hay's confessions. Each time Haig's counsel, Maxwell Fyfe, rose confidently in his black gown to say no questions, the case rested entirely on whether Haigh was mad or sane. Pleas of insanity require expert evidence from psychiatrists. A jury's general impressions and intuitions have no formal standing, nor in law does the belief that anyone who repeatedly kills must be insane. At the time of Haigh's trial, psychiatry was no longer in its infancy, but the art of giving plausible, coherent medical testimony about matters of the mind was still in its early days. For his evidence to be plausible, a psychiatrist must himself be plausible while giving evidence in the witness box. He must speak in ways a practical mind or jury can understand, showing he shares their values. Above all, he must never be intimidated by the prosecuting counsel. Dr. Henry Yellowlees, the defense's only witness at Haigh's trial, lacked these qualities. A consultant and lecturer at St. Thomas Hospital in London, Dr. Yellowlees was a withdrawn, scholarly-looking man in striped trousers and black waistcoat and jacket. At 61 years of age, he was experienced at giving evidence in big trials, but was totally used to having his word taken as gospel. Haigh's case rested on the Norton rules, the 19th century guidelines concerning criminal sanity. They required a defendant to know what he was doing and that it was wrong in law before he can be held fully responsible. Maxwell Fyfe rose to open his defense of Haigh, fully aware that not one single word had yet been said in his client's favor. Straight away, he addressed the central issue. The disorder of the mind which I submit has affected the reason of the accused is that rare but quite well-known type of mental aberration which is called, in psychological medication, pure paranoia, he said. Maxwell Fyfe went on to trace a link between the textbook ideas about his condition and the perverted religious visions which Haigh claimed to be gripped by. In the case of pure paranoia, he said, it really amounts, as it develops and gets greater hold, to practically self-worship, and that is commonly expressed by a conviction in the mind of the patient that he is in some mystical way under the control of a guiding spirit, which means infinitely more to him and is of infinitely greater authority than any human laws or rules of society. Yellowlees testified that Haigh was paranoid. Maxwell Fyfe asked him to expand on this. It is generally held to result from hereditary and partly, or perhaps even so, from environment, by which I mean specifically the early upbringing, the home surroundings, and the early experiences, Yellowlees replied. Maxwell Fyfe asked his witness if he believed Haigh's claims to have drunk his victim's blood. I think it's pretty certain that he tasted it, Yellowlees said, though I do not know whether he actually drank it. From a medical point of view, I do not think it was important, for the reason that this question of blood runs through all his fantasies from childhood like a motif. He went on to describe how Haigh's paranoia could be detected in his love of hoodwinking people and in his conceit and fantasy world. The psychiatrist, although rattled by questions from the judge, regained his composure and offered his interpretation of different facets of Haigh's life. Yellowlees said that there was a complete absence of sexual activity or interest, and that in itself, of course, is an abnormal thing. Maxwell Fyfe asked what this signified. It is an indication of a very great abnormality of some kind, Yellowlees replied. It happens also to be stated in authoritative works that this is a thing you find in a paranoiac who sublimates his sexual energies into the worship of himself and his mystic fantasies. Several times during Yellowlees' evidence, the judge interrupted him to demand that the defense clarify some of his evidence. He objected, for example, to Yellowlees interpreting some of Haigh's claims and childhood experiences before these were established in evidence. Many of these objections were legal points directed at Maxwell Fyfe, who apologized. The effect of the judge's interruptions, however, was to suggest that Yellowlees was irresponsible, a child with naive ideas who needed scolding by men of the world. Despite the judge's objections, their manner betrayed his absolute contempt for Yellowlees' evidence. The defense struggled manfully to make up for its lost dignity, and its portrait of a mocking criminal, driven and controlled by a nameless higher power, emerged eloquently and plausibly. For a short while, Haigh appeared worthy of pity as well as loathing. The defense examination ended. Whatever impression Dr. Yellowlees had made was promptly ruined by the opening thrust of the Attorney General's cross-examination. You said when you gave your evidence that you had seen the prisoner 5 times. You had examined him 5 times. That is not accurate, is it? Yellowlees, after some confusion and delving into his notes, apologized for his error. He then admitted he had no notes of the dates on which he had visited Haigh in prison, nor any idea of the total length of their meetings. The Attorney General said this had been 2 hours and 10 minutes. Is that right? The Attorney General asked. I do not know. Is it about right? I do not know. Is it about right? The Attorney General repeated. I have got no idea. Yellowlees was then asked, since Haigh was a notorious liar, what objective signs of insanity existed in him. There are no such things as objective signs of insanity, Yellowlees replied, adding that his evidence was based on lifelong experiences of cumulative symptoms. The Attorney General asked him to name one. I am relying upon his verbosity, his egocentricity, the fact that he is unable to speak the truth, the fact that he has no shadow of remorse or shame, replied Yellowlees. Soon after, the Attorney General put his case directly to the doctor. It was necessary to show that Haigh knew he was committing wrongs. I am asking you to look at the facts and tell the jury whether there is any doubt that he must have known that according to British law he was preparing to do and subsequently had done something which was wrong. I will say yes to that if you say punishable by law instead of wrong, Yellowlees said. Punishable by law, and therefore wrong by the law of this country, yes? Yes, I think he knew that, Yellowlees replied. Quietly, in the ways of English trials, a watershed had been reached and passed. Haigh's one witness, a man qualified to pronounce him insane, and who had actually appeared to believe he was, had testified that Haigh knew his crimes were acts of wrongdoing. Maxwell Fyfe drew upon all of his eloquence to plead the impairment of his client's mind. But as a lawyer, he knew his case was all but defeated. His speech lasted several hours, only to be followed up by a cuttingly, contemptuously brief reply from the Attorney General. The judge, despite his earlier impatience with Dr. Yellowlees, neglected nothing of value in the defense of his summing up. He explored the theory of paranoia, examined Haigh's actions and personality, but he was obliged to prove insanity and had not made out the semblance of a case. The jury took just 15 minutes to find Haigh guilty of murder. Sentenced to death, he was driven away from the court by grim-faced police officers still smiling brightly and looking immaculate. On the advice of his counsel, Haigh had not gone into the witness box, since his word under oath would have meant nothing. Maxwell Fyfe also feared that Haigh's cocksure ways would have irritated the jury, as would his detailed clinical description of the death of Mrs. Durand Deacon. Strangely, it was the dryly academic Dr. Yellowlees who managed to irritate the jury on Haigh's behalf. Haigh's cheek had let him down. If he had not mocked the police by saying they would never find Mrs. Durand Deacon's body, or insulted the court by doing crossword puzzles, or undermined his defense by inventing a symptom of madness, he might have met a different fate. Haigh would become prisoner number 7663 at Wandsworth Prison in South London. As a condemned man, he had to finally swap his smart green suit and shiny shoes for the prison suit worn in the death cells. By this stage, his hopes of being sent to Broadmoor had evaporated. By law, the Home Secretary was bound to appoint psychiatrists to study any prisoners condemned to death. The 3 responsible for Haigh reported that he was sane. Haigh never said anything more about the 3 further murders he had confessed to in Lewes Prison on remand. It has never yet been established whether or not Haigh ever committed them, or whether he merely invented them to back up his plea of insanity. Yet he still seemed to be in good spirits. Immediately after the sentence, he had been taken down to the common room at Lewes Assizes. A court official asked if he would like to see the chaplain. Haigh had his feet up on the table, while sipping tea and puffing on a cigarette. I don't much see the point, do you, old boy? He quipped. Inside Wandsworth, Haigh wrote many letters. One was to Dr. Yellowlees thanking him for his help. All the outstanding personalities throughout history, Haigh wrote, have been considered odd. Confucius, Jesus Christ, Julius Caesar, Muhammad, Napoleon, and even Hitler. My headmistress at the high school and my headmasters at the grammar school both reported that I was not a normal boy. On the 24th of July, 5 days after his trial ended, Haigh passed his 40th birthday in the condemned cell. His mother had sent him a card, but Haigh swept aside her suggestions of a visit, asking her to discuss it with his solicitor. The question was never raised again. As the days wore on, Haigh finally lost the poise he had maintained since Mrs. Duran Deacon went missing. After spells of depression and petulance, he began compiling notes about his nightmares, particularly those who concerned blood. However, he never spoke openly about them. Neither to his guards nor in his letters did he ever express remorse or shame for his crimes. Though clearly depressed at losing his celebrity status once the trial was over, Haigh had lost none of his flair for showmanship. He donated his favourite suit, tie and socks to Madame Tussauds so that the memory of his elegance could survive, even in the Chamber of Horrors. Haigh insisted that the model of him should have its shirt cuffs showing at least 1 inch below the sleeves of the jacket. Haigh did not appeal against his conviction, and the Home Office announced that there would be no reprieve. Soon after, the governor of Wandsworth Prison, Major A.C.N. Benkei, received a request from Haigh to rehearse his own execution. "My weight is deceptive," Haigh said. "I have a light, springy step, and I would not like there to be any mistakes." Major Benkei assured him there would be no difficulty, and despite Haigh's persistence, the request was turned down. Haigh's letters to his parents from the death cell managed to preserve an air of peace and acceptance. He wrote to them with affection, though some commentators believed that he was secretly gloating over the misery he had brought down on them. It's also been observed that Haigh seemed to feel as little pity for himself as he had for his victims. The letters treated the approaching execution as a sad, tiresome event. Haigh neither reproached nor justified anyone, least of all himself. His final letter on the eve of execution began, "My dearest Mum and Dad, thank you for your very touching letter which I received this morning, and which will, I suppose, be your last." Haigh went on to say that though he found some parts of his Plymouth Brethren upbringing restrictive, there was much that was lovely. He spoke of a sweet little note he had received from someone, then raised himself into the kind of grandiloquent terms to which his father had always spoken. "We cannot change the inscrutable predictions of the Eternal. I, that is my spirit, shall remain earthbound for some time. My mission is not yet fulfilled." Haigh did not explain what this mission was. The letter went on to describe how to switch the short-band channel of his radio to pick up American stations. This would be among the possessions sent to his family after his death. There was no trace in the letter of any link in Haigh's mind between those lovely days in childhood and the savagery of his criminal career, but Haigh himself had always aimed at leaving no trace and boasted of this to the Chelsea police in February 1949. In the end, the only mystery he kept was what he was truly thinking. The poise that had briefly deserted him returned. Smiling brightly, Haigh was executed at 9 a.m. on the 10th of August 1949. Hundreds of people were crowded outside the gates of Wandsworth Prison when the official notice was put up. He was buried, as was customary in the cases of execution, inside the precincts of the prison wall. On her deathbed, Haigh's mother, Emily, a broken woman, passed her son's letter to a friend for safekeeping, saying, "We used to despise the people in the village because we thought we were God's elect, but we were not.